Welcome to Godsplaining, Contemplative Preachers, Contemporary Age. Each week, join the Dominican friars as they consider all things Catholic.
Welcome to Godsplaining. My name is Father Bonaventure, and I am joined by Father Gregory Pine, who is in the Alpine region, if that's right, in Switzerland. How are you doing, Father Gregory?
That is right. Yeah. I'm doing well. I am in the Alpine region of Switzerland. I think Switzerland's a pretty small country, so you can always at least see the mountains, unless you're like in a basement covered in a bunch of blankets. But then, for the most part, you're in the mountains, which is awesome, because if you want to go hiking in Washington, D.C., you have to get on I-66 and then, spend half of your life in traffic and then eventually arrive at a mountain. Whereas here, I can roll. I mean, that's a mixed image, because if I were rolling, I would be rolling downhill, and then I would be getting further away from the mountains. Regardless, I'm in the Alpine region. It's good to be here. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm in not the Alpine region. I'm in the city region, so D.C., the belly of the beast, you could say. And it's unseasonably cold, I suspect. It's probably in the 20s or 30s recently. So it's been a cold. We didn't have a cold winter until recently, but it's nice. I don't mind the snow, and I like the cold. So it just means outside bundled up, which is great. It reminds me of growing up in Buffalo, New York, and people think Buffalo is a really cold place, but it's not as cold as Wisconsin. If you're listening and you're in Wisconsin, hats off to you. Well, leave your hat on, but my hats are off to you when I'm indoors, because it is cold out in Wisconsin. Absolutely frigid. So, but it's still a delightful place in Wisconsin to be. But I'm happy to be here in D.C., and we'll begin to spring at some point, but we've got month of February to get through as well. So, speaking of disappointing topics like February, I mean, there's no holiday in it, right, except for Valentine's Day, which takes on a special character for us as Dominicans. We thought we'd talk about, since we're past the holidays, the holiday season, what have you, and yet we're still in COVID tide, we thought we'd talk about talking about COVID. Because if you're like us, or like me, or like the person next to you, you might have found that it's kind of tricky to talk about COVID, especially with friends and family sometimes. Strangers, you can just kind of do your thing and then leave. But COVID, it seems, has become the new religion in politics, the kind of no-goes. And yet, it's like the weather. You've got to talk about it. But the conversations, at least to me, can get a little complicated. So, Father Gregory, do you experience any difficulties or troubles talking about COVID, or is it just kind of fist pumps and high fives and everything else?
Yeah, I too experience difficulties in talking about COVID. And I think, in part because each person has his own experience of the pandemic. It may have affected people closer or less close. Yeah, I'm just addicted to parallel structure. So if I say closer, I want a word that ends with to be its opposite. It's like remoter. No, that doesn't gonna work. So because people have different experiences of the pandemic, because people have known those who have gotten really sick or have died or don't, and then because people kind of engage in the conversation in different registers, I think that it's a total mixed bag. And you're right. Sometimes you do feel like you're walking in a minefield. And that can make it, that just can make it really difficult to navigate the conversation for one, but to try to build anything like consensus for another. So, that's been my experience.
It's such a, if we do the religion-politics comparison, right? Religion is a difficult issue for some people to talk about, because there's so much riding on, in a sense, eternal life and all the ultimate values of the world. But it's also not as existentially present. You could actually not think about religion for a minute or two, and nothing, you could not make decisions on religion and you wouldn't see the ramifications immediately, in a sense, although you would see them. And you would see, as in terms of virtuous living. And then politics is politics is such a grab bag anyway. COVID is weird because it's as you say, it's a minefield, but one that you feel compelled to enter, because there's no way of escaping it. We're stuck in this thing, and it's a biological fact. I think viruses are living, right? Or is that bacteria? Bacteria living, viruses are just kind of like those little space pods, right? I have just exhausted all of my knowledge about biology. I know there are different kinds of animals, and I know that some of them live in different kinds of kingdoms. I know that viruses are something, and I don't know anything about them. So anyway, I think they look like a little space lander or whatever, right? And they do something with DNA, and so you fight them with like RNA, and then you see. Now this is part of the deal because COVID's the real thing. It's happening. There seems to be something happening out there, right? But it's hard to know exactly what's going on because there's so many questions involved in it, right? We just talked about the science aspect of it here. Like, I don't know anything about this thing. I know what viruses are, kind of. I mean, a little bit. And how to treat them and what to do with them. I know a little about that. But there's also questions about, like, moral questions about, well, what kind of level of risk is acceptable in one's life? Like, for instance, if it's possible or if it's permissible to risk certain things and how you value those risks, what a human life and the risk of a human life is worth it. Because you could say, well, we shouldn't do anything that risks any human life possible. And you think, well, then we shouldn't drive cars because people die in cars, so we shouldn't do that. Or we shouldn't wear seatbelts, or we shouldn't, we should just sit by ourselves alone. You say, no, you've got to take some risks to live life. Well, what's the acceptable level of risk? Well, that's a moral question, right? About how you measure values. And there's political questions involved here about, like, what is the best way, given that we're in a troubling situation as a society. Well, how do you organize the society? How do you put what's the right way politically, pragmatically, or even morally in a sense, to involve the state? And then there are philosophical questions about how you can even know something. What level of knowledge do you have to have compared to someone else? And then there are personal questions about just the fact that COVID takes away your autonomy, and I don't think anyone experienced COVID and thinking, this is great, I am so happy, I love every part of this. I think we're all on a spectrum of how we experience this, but I doubt anyone is personally feeling energized by the situation we're in. So it just seems like there's a whole lot of stuff, a lot of different disciplines involved here, and it really taxes, I think, the human mind and the human will to work with each other.
Yeah, and I think that part of the conflict that we experience is a conflict of competence. So it's difficult for us to discern what we have competence over and what we do not have competence over. So for instance, obviously we have a competence with respect to the personal questions. Each of us knows to some extent what we are and are not capable of. So it's like, I know that trying to go to an airport and board a flight is just too traumatic, right? I used to love airports, but now I find them as places where I'm constantly anguished about whether or not I have the right paperwork. And so if I'm going somewhere and there's a possibility to take a train, I'm probably going to exercise that option now. Whereas formerly, I may have, chosen to fly. So it's like, I know what I am and am not capable of. I have competence in this realm. And then you start going from there, like family questions. Are mother and father competent to determine their children, whether or not they get vaccinated, to determine whether their children like go to school or get homeschooled, and what their children will and will not be able to to handle when it comes to pandemic measures. And then you go from there, and then you're talking about political issues, and here, all right, we make a contribution, but it's a little bit diluted if we're in a big society. And and also depending on the democratic processes, it might matter less or it might matter more. But then when we go from there to to talk about the big ticket philosophical questions, to talk about the kind of scientific questions, sometimes we're cognizant of the fact that we're outside of our ken, and it can be, I suppose it can be somewhat disconcerting to be so deeply and personally affected by a very, very grave situation, and to feel that a lot of the decision making has passed beyond your control.
Yes.
And I think that that's part of the reason for which many of us experience a kind of intensity, a kind of urgency surrounding the situation. We feel like we need to express ourselves, we need to be heard. But then in the process of that, we come crashing up against other human beings who feel very similarly, at least in terms of motivation, but who feel very differently when it comes to the actual content or when it comes to the measures that ought to be deployed. So it's like, yeah, it's just a recipe for conflict, or it's a recipe for, kind of chaotic discourse. And I think that's what we're presently experiencing.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. We want to get to talk about, the how to kind of mitigate that in the second half of this. But I think you touched on something really important about competence and sort of trusting others, because we have to get information from the organs of state, you could say, from newspapers and from shows and wherever we get them from, I suppose. And this has to be a government action in a way, and there have to be experts. But we live in a society, today, where expert is something that isn't just given; it's something in a sense earned by us. And now that's a problem in and of itself, because it's hard to say who grants expertise. Well, the field does or something. So someone grabs doctorates, or you're hired to be in charge of particular places. But I think we live in a world, or at least it strikes me in the West, where an expert can say something, but then we know that there's another expert saying the exact opposite thing. This is especially true for science. I mean, climate stuff has a little bit of this involved in it. But any sort of political, scientific crossover issue has this element of skepticism, I could say. I don't know if it's even healthy, but it just is our condition that when someone says something on the TV about this is what's going to happen, I don't know if that's true. It's not the weather kind of level where it's like, this is your best shot, and I know it's difficult, but it's a general skepticism towards political discourse from the media, which I have, and from the political class, which I have, and I think a lot of us have, no matter what side of the spectrum you're on. You might think, I just don't trust organizations to give me just give me the facts and the details anymore. And that's particularly troubling here because we don't have access to. I can't just go up and look and know what to do about the pandemic. Whereas other things, if I don't want to listen to the news about some story, or I feel like they're not giving the story correctly, I can go and investigate, and it's all available to me. This one, the pandemic, I'm not sure if the expertise is available. I'm pretty sure it's not available to me. And so I'm left trusting people that I have a hesitancy, and I mean, maybe this speaks more about myself than others, but I'm suspicious of people who say this is people that speak in political situations and say this is absolutely what's going to be the case and all of this, and it makes it extremely difficult for me. I just feel discombobulated and out of control a little bit, and maybe that's part of the issue too.
Yeah, and I think too. So I mean, again, lots of reasons for which. One of them is with the media, because I don't know if 2022 is any more polarized than 1887. We speak about it as if it were, like political discourse is becoming increasingly fractious. But because media has polarized with our current political regime, we make a decision as to what we want to hear when we choose what channel we turn on or which site we frequent. So it's not like we've all kind of conceded the fact that there's no such thing as objective recounting of facts, because media is, what are they motivated by? Like, they know that if they can make you sad, angry, or fearful, that they're going to have a better chance at retaining your viewership. So they're thinking about that. They're also, like all other human beings, who are somewhat motivated by wealth or power or, fame, honor, glory, whatever it is. A lot of these secondary mixed motivations, sometimes they become dominant in the life, and that's the scariest of all. So this is how we're getting the information. And then we're also getting it from people who, suffer the same temptations. So when somebody says, like, I'm expert in this, it's like, okay, but are you expert in humanity? Can I trust you? Can I have a relationship with you? Is there any way in which to verify this content based on some other human factor? Because if you say, I know lots of things about science, like you said, there are 1,000 people on YouTube who claim to know a lot of things about science who are prepared to say the exact opposite thing. And statistics, studies are so easily manipulatable, it seems, depending on how you call the data, how you present the data, where you start it, where you end it, etc. I'm showing my lack of knowledge about statistics. I took one statistics class in math statistics, my senior year, I think. Whatever, who cares? So as a result of which we feel acutely the experience of, being manipulated, being controlled, being led around to think X, Y, and Z things when we might not be on board for thinking X, Y, and Z things. And that causes us, a deep suspicion and a kind of tacit despair about the possibility of knowing and the possibility of really engaging on substantive issues.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, as you were saying that, because there's a political question here involved, we like to think we're all Democrats. I mean, in a sense, a small d sense, that we believe in voting and having our will be heard. And so if we lose an election, that's fair enough. But with this one, you don't get to vote on anything. You just have to. So it's a political situation that doesn't function in our kind of, egalitarian, Republican, Democratic kind of liberal democracy, you could say, that spectrum. So we feel, part of it I think is also what makes it difficult is because we don't feel like we're being heard, but there's no way to be heard in this way other than like elections. And when stuff changes so quickly, you don't get a chance to really make your voice heard. For a political situation where we're used to playing the game of at least we have our voice at the voting box, and then whatever happens, we kind of live with. So this makes it all complicated, extremely complicated. So if you have trouble with COVID conversations with people, friends, family, or just strangers, anybody, there's no surprise to that. There's just a lot of stuff going on. But we don't want to leave it with just saying, oh, it's complicated, throw up the hands, and, let's hopefully COVID won pretty soon. We want to have solutions, or at least attempt something. So after the break, we'll talk a little about some tips, or at least our thoughts, as inadequate as they are, about how to go about and how we go about doing better and having passable conversations and charitable conversations with those, even if we don't agree with people in our friends, family circle, or anybody about COVID. So just take a minute, and we'll come back after the break and talk about some possible solutions.
You are listening to Godsplaining. Visit us at godsplaining.org to listen to our episodes, shop our store, and donate to our podcast. All gifts go to improving the podcast and bringing the gospel to more listeners. Thanks for your support.
Okay, we're back, and we're talking about COVID and the fact that the COVID conversations are super frustrating, especially with those we love. And we've talked about a little bit why that is, because expertise is hard to come by or understand or willing to admit. Personal discomfort with the whole situation, our anxieties about not knowing things today, since we're so used to knowing everything and have everything at our fingertips. I think that adds to the stress of it. And then just the political, moral questions that normally come up. It's all just here. It's all here. And then bringing God, I suppose. What's God got to do with this, in providence and the pandemic? And you could imagine that it's even more complicated. But those are the complicated situations. But we'll bring it down to earth here and say, how Father Gregory, do you think we can go ahead and make a start at having a conversation, since this is a minefield and it's fraught? How do we go about thinking correctly, or at least thinking better about these conversations?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking of something that I want to say was Pope Benedict XVI described as intellectual charity, or we could describe it as a kind of intellectual humility. And this cuts in two directions. So the first is not necessarily to assume the best of others, but to make judgments which are favorable to others when they express contrary opinions. St. Thomas has this little line about the difference between judging things and judging people. It says if you judge things somewhat severely, it's not like they suffer from it. It's like, man, that is an ugly tree. It's like the tree doesn't subsequently toddle away and like blush unless it's an ent, and then you've got yourself a bigger problem because you're in the Lord of the Rings. But if I judge a person, and especially if that word gets out, right, that person stands to suffer from my judgment. And I can actually do violence to my own humanity in the process by becoming the type who's just looking for other human beings to disappoint him, who's just seeing in other human beings a kind of complex mess of conflicting opinions and utter absurdities and blah, blah, blah. It's just sound and fury signifying nothing. Okay. So to exercise a kind of generosity with respect to others, and then to exercise a kind of humility with respect to our own opinions. You cite often that sage American philosopher Donald Rumsfeld, who spoke of unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know that we don't know. Or, as Pocahontas once put it, the things you never knew you never knew. And there's a lot of unknowns at work here, and that should make us somewhat hesitant to pronounce in a way that's too strident or that's too not confident. I think it's fine to be confident, but in the sense of like potentially alienating by virtue of our vehemence, right? So to kind of soften the discourse by introducing a note of generosity towards the other and by introducing a note of humility with respect to our own opinions. I think that's a good, first step.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, charity and humility are always good things, especially in this conversational aspect. And I think they're hard to practice because you might have to say like, "Well, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I don't know." And because we live in such a polarized, now who is it more otherwise than before, but there's a sense in which the minute you say I don't know, the other person might think, well, I do know. And you might know the other person doesn't know. Right, that one of their unknown unknowns is their own competence in this particular area, and yet it's still hard to admit, and because they're going to deploy knowledge claims that they may not have access to, that to not do that yourself, so you end up basically shouting across at each other with things that both of you don't really have knowledge about. But the humility to say, "Oh, I'm not sure about that. I don't have. This is my opinion. This is my thought. These are my thoughts about it, but." To be honest, I'm not clear about this sort of thing myself. At least it opens up a space. I think the charity is the right humility to listen to imagine the conversation as if you're like finding out about someone, as opposed to, I think our immediate reaction, at least my immediate reaction with the COVID conversations, is to kind of stake my claims, to make my positions known, to kind of back someone off a bit about something. I think because there's just this personal discomfort about the whole situation, and you want to, at least, even if you're not happy about something, you want to be right about something. The charity and humility allows you to step back and say, well, this person is probably no different than I am. They're struggling with the same anxieties, same frustrations, and they're not being clear about things either, probably. But I might not be either. I might feel like I'm really certain about my things, but there might be some unknowns in there that I'm just not aware of. I think that's salubrious advice. Although it's difficult to practice in today's, because we have this sense, I think, where conversations are battles, the contests that need to have victors to them, like one side has to win, and that's just a politicization in general about things. Maybe we should have a conversation about just politics invading all of our language at some point. But that's certainly true here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think the idea that this other person, right, is another human being, right, and we are on opposite ends of this, whatever, political question, like naturally makes us to think, or makes us to tend in a kind of dialectical way. Yeah, like you said, we begin to think about it as struggle or as a battle. If you engage in a debate with another human being, the first question that's asked of you isn't, like, did you come to greater consensus? The first question that's asked of you is, did you win, right? Mm-hmm. But that's like not the point of human life. The point of human life is not to like vanquish all those against whom we find ourselves pitted in conversation. I mean, that might be the goal for Conan the Barbarian, who when asked, I believe, what's good in life, responded, to defeat your enemies, to have them driven before you, and to hear the cries and lamentation of the women. So if we don't want to pertain to the tribe of Conan, then we're going to have to, we're going to have to be willing to progress in a way that's a little more sloppy, a little less neat, just a little more human, because human life is just like that. Like, in everyone's, not everyone maybe, but most people have had this experience in a family situation where you hear somebody say like, I lost a friend who died of COVID, but I have made these particular judgments about COVID. And so I don't feel at ease, like expressing my sorrow or expressing my pain at the loss of my friend. It's like, you can feel sad that somebody whom you love died of COVID. And then you can make another judgment on the other hand about statistics, right? Mm-hmm. With the recognition that that person is 1 in 7 billion and that should enter into the conversation, but also that you love that person. That's fine. Like, it's laudable. It's praiseworthy to be a messy, not neat human being, because that's what we are in truth and fact. And if we try to make a narrative that's overly neat, then we're going to actually, do violence to that humanity.
Yeah, and I think because you raised that because there's so many overlapping issues here, this isn't just a political position or a moral position or a science position on science, this sort of thing, or just a personal position. But there's so many different levels on this thing that whenever you speak about you might be deploying a scientific argument, but this other person, that scientific argument is also connected to some other personal or moral argument, or some feeling in there, so that they're hearing not what you're saying, but what they would be saying if they were saying that. And that's just general true in conversation, in most conversations situations, are that it's very often easy to mishear someone. I remember when I was in Oxford, one of the most important parts of our exams, they drilled into us, answer the question. And you think, well, of course I'm going to answer the question. And he's like, no, you really make sure you take a minute to write down your own words, like what the question is asking of you. Because we just immediately project, if we see a couple words, oh, this is what the exam is asking for. But they're really good about, no, actually, you can entirely miss the question. And I found myself looking at going, wait, oh, that's what they're asking, because we fill it in. And how much more with people who are much more complicated than just Oxford examiners, that there is a lot behind anything they say. Now, you can't play double, second guessing, and we have to sally forth, you could say, into risks at some point. That's just what human communication is. But at the same time, it's worth remembering that people connect things differently than you might connect them, at least as I see it. And also to know, prudence says to say the right thing at the right time in the right way, to know if the person you're talking to might actually not be open to or able to hear out a sort of argument from either side about something because of their own personal experience. Something. It doesn't mean you just let them off from saying, well, whatever they say is true, but it does mean having, again, the charity of the other person and realizing COVID is not just like a political or mathematical or scientific position, but it's a personal experience that people take differently and brings a lot to bear. So to be gentle-ish around others is I think salubrious, although so darn difficult, and it makes you feel weak, I think, is the idea.
Yep.
But Paul does talk about the weaker brother, and I think it's important to remember that. That's just some thoughts.
Yeah, and maybe just my final thought on the matter is, it doesn't demand of you that you be naive. It doesn't demand of you that you perform mental gymnastics in order to justify the position of another human being. You might, have nigh unto certainty that the other human person has made an error. Like in the way that they are recounting the facts. Like, I want to say Justice Sotomayor said something about infant mortality with COVID that, increased it by a factor of like 1,000. It's like, okay, that's a publicly verifiable falsehood. That being the case, right, it doesn't mean that the other person is not a human being who has a part to play in the conversation and in the discourse. Because, again, the point is not to vanquish. The point is to grow. And I think here, like a little return to virtue is helpful. Mm-hmm. Like, when will it come about that we will trust other humans to actually communicate to us the truth? I mean, in heaven at the second coming for sure. But I think that we can actually create communities, or we can create environments in which virtuous people who might think differently about matters are able to engage each other in a way that's not only respectful in the sense of like, I will not say something egregious so that I myself don't come across as, a brute, but like that are actually truth-seeking and that see discourse as instrumental to an attainment of a deeper consensus, to a richer reality, which is actually formative of all those human beings who participate in it. And I think that this is what politics is intended to be, a common meditation on the common good, a common conversation in the context of a common life. And is that Pollyanna-ish to think that we can reconstitute that in the current climate? Perhaps a little bit, right? But I think that if you despair of certain ideals, your humanity ends up withering and desiccating. And so I think it's worthwhile to hold them in mind and heart, even if, you feel like you're fighting a long defeat, to quote Tolkien there. So, yeah, I think that's my last thought.
No, that's why, no, that is, yeah, we could be skeptical or cynical about the possibility of virtuous discourse, but there's, if you're not going to, there's no way you're going to have it unless you attempt it, unless you hope for the best and pray that you be given the grace and that others be given the grace to grow in that virtue, so that we do have to attempt it and assume that, some aspect we can have virtuous discourse, especially with those who are around us, I'd hope. If we can't have it with those around us, then who are we supposed to have it with? Well, those are just some pointers and some thoughts. I think we're going to be in COVID for a while, hopefully another day or two. But if it takes more than a week or two, we'll be having more conversations around it. And it's a chance to reflect for a moment on how we do it and the difficulties, but also the promises of being able to grow explicitly in holiness and charity and humility with those around us, and in truth. So if you've liked this episode, please share it around with those that you might know in these conversations. Like it and do all the social media kind of stuff. Thank you for supporting us on Patreon. If you've supporting us with our technology and paying our assistant and all the kind of great things. We actually have some great things, of course. They're coming up. We have 3 retreats this summer, which are open now, so you can sign up for them. I'm going to shoot it over to Father Gregory, although I think I know 2 of them are in July, and then one of them is the men's wilderness retreat is in August. But Father Gregory, do you want to say anything about the retreats that I might, so I don't put them in the wrong place?
No, yeah, you nailed it. So Young Adults Retreat is July 22nd through 24th in the same place that it was last summer, right? So Huntington, New York, out on Long Island. And then an all-comers retreat. So, whomever would like to come, you're the most welcome. And that's in the same place from July 29th through 31st. And then the Men's Wilderness Retreat is in Brevard, North Carolina, outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And that's August 11th through 14th. And that's a young men's wilderness retreat. So young adults is 21 through 33. All-comers is all-comers. And then Young Men's Wilderness Retreat is, again, 21 through 33. So those are the specs.
Well, we hope to see you there if you get a chance. We had a great time with the first retreat last summer. It's a beautiful location. It's absolutely gorgeous. Lots of land. It's a fantastic time to get together and talk with each other, to meet each other in virtuous conversation, and also to learn hopefully truths from us, but at least some humility as well from our side of things. And it's wonderful to see you all, so because we're usually speaking into cameras, it's actually great to sit down and talk to people who listen to the podcast and enjoy it. So from Washington, D.C. and from Switzerland, this is Father Bonaventure and Father Gregory. We'll be praying for you, pray for us, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks for listening to Godsplaining, a work of the Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Leave a review on your podcast app and visit us at godsplaining.org.